Okay, so second paper presented is systematically detecting packet validation vulnerabilities in embedded network stacks. And the presenter, I think, is Pashal. So the floor is yours.
Hi, everyone. Thank you for coming to my talk today. I am Pascal Amusu from Purdue University, and today I will be discussing our paper on systematically detecting packet validation vulnerabilities in embedded network stack. I recognize the contributions of my co-authors and appreciate support from our funders. Today, devices are getting connected to the internet to make them smarter and to enhance monitoring and control. For example, our kitchen appliances, our cars, and even medical devices like the pacemakers all now connect to the internet. Some of these manufacturers even provide mobile applications to enable this connectivity. Unfortunately, this level of connectivity introduces significant security risk, and that is what we'll be discussing today. To enable internet connectivity, the smart devices in the previous slide rely on an embedded network stack. An embedded network stack, or ENS, or any network stack at all, is the software component that allows an application, or in this case, an embedded application, to connect to the internet. It is just a set of network protocol implementations that has been tailored for and used in embedded systems. Here in this figure, the ENS comprises everything within this brown box. And as we can see, it connects the firmware to the network hardware. But even regular operating systems such as Linux and Windows have their own network stacks. So what makes the ENS interesting to study? Regular operating systems such as Linux have software and hardware protections in place that prevent the exploitation of vulnerabilities. For example, we have the ASLR, address space layout randomizations, and stack canaries that make the exploitation of buffer overflow vulnerabilities very difficult. Unfortunately, embedded systems do not have these protections. Hence, there is greater need to detect and eliminate critical vulnerabilities from these systems. Also, it is worth knowing that these ENS are closely tailored to embedded applications and their operating systems, and hence they have very diverse characteristics. Before we look at an example of an ENS vulnerability, here is a network packet comprising the Ethernet, IPv4, and TCP headers. Here, let's indicate one field, the MSS option field with a brown box. Here is a snippet of code from FreeRTOS as of 2018 when this vulnerability was discovered. I'll use this example to illustrate what an ENS vulnerability looks like. FreeRTOS is an open source embedded operating system that is currently maintained by AWS. So remember the MSS option field that we previously discussed in the last slide. In the last line, here we can see that the MSS field is being used as a divisor in this operation. If that value is 0, as shown in our packet, we get a division by 0 vulnerability, which can lead to a denial of service attack. For embedded systems such as a pacemaker or a car, a denial of service attack can have very disastrous consequences. In order to properly understand and detect these ENS vulnerabilities, we define the following 4 research questions. First, we study the ENS vulnerabilities and identify their characteristics. With our results and findings, we design a bounded systematic detection tool that is capable of detecting these ENS vulnerabilities. So the first part, here is our methodology. We selected 6 ENS with different and diverse characteristics. Next, we collected and analyzed 66 vulnerability reports related to the selected ENS from the NVD. During our preliminary study, we noticed that 61 of these 66 vulnerabilities directly relate to the processing and validation of packets. Hence, they are triggered by sending specific vulnerable packets to the ENS. We term these 61 vulnerabilities as packet validation vulnerabilities or PV vulnerabilities, and they form the focus of our study. For each report, we studied both the characteristics of the vulnerable code and the characteristics of the packet needed to trigger the vulnerability. Our first result shows the different classes of vulnerabilities in our datasets according to their CWE classification. At least 70% of the vulnerabilities are memory corruption vulnerabilities, buffer overflows, out of bound reads, out of bound writes. We noticed these memory corruption vulnerabilities had some peculiar and interesting patterns that made them evade detection by default configurations of the normal address sanitizers, ASAN. But then we looked deeper to understand the causes of these vulnerabilities. We saw that 86% of these vulnerabilities were caused by the absence of proper field validations, while the remaining 10 included vulnerabilities such as double free and infinite loops. For the vulnerabilities caused by improper field validations, we looked at the fields that resulted in these vulnerabilities. In the network packets, a total of 41 different fields caused this set of 51 vulnerabilities. But then, next we analyzed the statefulness of the vulnerabilities. We found that 70% of the vulnerabilities were stateless, and the other 30% either required the protocol to be in a specific state or required a specific sequence of packets to get triggered. In summary, our results from this first team shows that ENS vulnerabilities were mostly memory corruption vulnerabilities. They are caused by diverse field packets, and they occur in different protocol states. So how can we detect them reliably? To aid our design, we identified the following 4 requirements. First, we should reliably detect memory corruption vulnerabilities. Because of the wide range of duty fields and duty protocol states, we should also explore all fields and all protocol states in the protocols we are testing. Also, because ENS has diverse characteristics and dynamic analysis involves interacting with the system under test, we should design a system that can work easily across all the various ENSs. This figure here shows our design of EmNetTest. It satisfies all the previous requirements we identified. Because of time constraints, in our next slide, we'll only explain in detail our main algorithm, which enables the systematic test case generation currently identified by requirement 2. Here is a network packet comprising the Ethernet IPv4 and TCP headers. We can see that this packet comprises multiple fields, and most of them are within 1 to 2 bytes. So these are some of the fields. Our analysis shows that we can trigger vulnerabilities when we mutate individual fields instead of mutating the packet as a whole. EmNetTest starts from the first field, here the destination MAC address. It samples values across the range of the field, guided by a configurable sampling stride key. It replaces this value with each sampled value and injects each mutated packet into the ENS. Now we do this for each field in the packet. After doing it for each individual field, we do it for a combination of fields, starting with n equals to 2 till the value that you configure as your maximum combination value. Now let's talk about our results. To evaluate, we first evaluate EmNetTest's ability to detect known vulnerabilities. We collected a set of 14 vulnerabilities that affected the protocols our prototype currently supports, TCP, IP, and UDP protocols. And of the 14 vulnerabilities in the set, we were able to detect 12 of them with using EmNetTest, and couldn't detect the remaining 2 due to time constraints and some IPv6 specific features. We also tested EmNetTest's ability to detect new vulnerabilities. And we were able to detect 7 new vulnerabilities with 6 CV assigned. One interesting finding here that we had, look at this first context key vulnerability and the fourth Pico TCP vulnerability currently indicated with the arrows. They are both out of bound read vulnerabilities caused by an invalid MSS option length. They have similar patterns. Also, look at the first Pico TCP vulnerability indicated there. and the first free authors vulnerability indicated. They also have similar patterns, being a division by zero vulnerability caused by the MSS option field having a zero value. We saw this repeated pattern of vulnerabilities across different ENSs and across different protocols. Here we have an example of a vulnerability. This Pico checksum adder function is called when Pico TCP tries validating the IP checksum field. The function is called with a pointer to the IP header and the IP header length gotten from the packet. Here it sums the bytes of the IP header, but the variable there stop depends on the length variable, which is the IP header length value gotten from the packet. Hence, by setting the IP header length field to a higher value, this block of code can read outside the bounds of the network packets. So before we conclude, let's just highlight two interesting findings and make a call to everyone to work on this. First, we found cases of repeated vulnerabilities across different ENSs. But this isn't an isolated event. In fact, two recent papers have conducted and reported results on this same phenomenon. We think that there should be better approaches to help software engineers learn from their own mistakes and mistakes made in other projects, so we reduce the frequency of repeated vulnerabilities. Second is the aspect of testing for embedded network stacks or network protocol implementations. Currently, one of the standard approaches for vulnerability detection is fuzzing, and Google provides infrastructure to aid fuzzing. But the problem is fuzzing is non-deterministic, and the vulnerabilities Google OSS fuzz finds is detected very late in the SDLC, in the software development lifecycle. So can we go back to reviewing testing practices for these protocol implementations and developing more systematic approaches that can aid vulnerability detection during development time, not after the product has already been released, or in addition to? So to conclude, we studied 61 ENS vulnerabilities and designed EmNetTest to aid in detecting these vulnerabilities. As a takeaway, we learned that in this specific context of network protocol implementations, bounded systematic testing was effective at finding typical packet validation vulnerabilities. The preprint of our paper, as well as our artifacts, is available through these QR codes. Thank you for listening to my presentation. I'll be happy to answer any questions you may have, either now or after the session. And I can also be reached through my email address on the screen. Thank you very much.
Thank you. So we have time for one or two quick questions.